Dan Norton has his PhD in philosophy and specializes mostly in talking about Ayn Rand's philosophies regarding objectivism, some areas of libertarianism, and really just everything encompassing that school of thought. And he also does YouTube where he debates, he chats, he talks, and really just explores a lot of the philosophies in these areas. I got introduced to him via one of the Discord servers. I was asking if there were people that were in the server that, do YouTube and make videos like this. And then somebody suggested that I reach out to him, which I did. And I'm just really grateful that I got to listen to some of his stuff and talk to him. And now we get to have this conversation. But Dan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then tell some of the viewers some important things that they should know about you.
All right, thanks for having me on your show. And as Elijah said, I've got a YouTube channel, and I use that primarily to promote Ayn Rand's ideas. Her philosophy is called Objectivism. I've been doing it for about 5 years. I got a PhD in philosophy before that. And I'll just make one comment about libertarianism because I'm often called a libertarian, but I wouldn't actually call myself that. And Ayn Rand tried to distance herself from the libertarian movement. She thought they had plagiarized or hijacked some of her ideas and taken them out of context, and then end up promoting some ideas that she would strongly disagree with. And I would just want to also put some distance between myself and the libertarian movement. I prefer the term objectivist. I think that would be a more accurate term for me. But we can get into that some more later if you want to. But as far as intro goes, I think that about covers it.
Yeah, and I kind of just wanted to get like, an introduction of your character and your schooling and some of these interests. Now, I guess broadly, when you talk about Ayn Rand, what are some of these points or, things that she talks about that you think maybe the majority of the public knows about, or like what are the light bulbs that spark when you say that you study and purport a lot of Ayn Rand's philosophies? Like, what are people thinking about? And can you kind of walk me through some of these like core tenets of Ayn Rand?
Sure. So Ayn Rand is probably best known as a novelist. So her most famous books are The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. But they're unusual novels in that they're explicitly philosophical. So if you've ever read these books, you will know that sometimes you'll come across a very long speech by a character, which might go on for many pages. Um, so she's an unusual novelist. She actually called herself a novelist philosopher, like hyphenated novelist philosopher, because she's really done both. She does work in both, and she, in her later career after Atlas Shrugged, she turned to writing nonfiction, and throughout the 60s and 70s, she, I think, pretty much wrote exclusively nonfiction. So she has collections of books on ethics, on politics. She has one on epistemology, another on aesthetics. As for some of her best known tenets, she's famous for promoting selfishness. She has a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, a new concept of egoism. That's the subtitle. And she has a distinctive view of what selfishness actually consists of. It's not the typical view of you're a brute, you're a rude jerk who doesn't care about anyone else or who violates other people's rights, who lies, cheats, and steals. She would say that's a straw man of what genuine selfishness or self-interest consists in. And then the other key tenet she's very known for and controversial for is her promotion of capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism. So the complete separation of government from economics. There's no government intervention in the economy at all. So there's no taxes, no forcibly taking people's wealth and then redistributing it. No regulating of people's lives, of businesses. So there's no place for initiating force against others. The only role of the government, according to Rand, is to use retaliatory force to protect people. So you would have a police force, for instance, to stop rapists and muggers and murderers from harassing people in society. You would have a military to protect Americans from foreign initiators of force who might want to conquer or enslave people in America. And then you have a court system to peacefully settle disputes between people. So if you have a civil dispute with your neighbor or someone, you don't resort to force. You don't have to have a fight. You can take it to the courts and have a peaceful way of settling it. So the only role of government, according to Rand, is to extract the use of force from society so it's a peaceful society. Other than that, everything should be left to the free market. So there's no multi-billion or trillion-dollar programs like Social Security or Medicare, which take wealth from some, distribute it to others. There's no public education. There's no public roads, no public post office. All these things are private. So America today is a very far cry from a truly capitalist system, although it often is called capitalist. And I think that causes a lot of problems because people will look at America today and point out various problems and then blame it on capitalism. But Rand would say, no, we don't have capitalism at all. We haven't ever had pure capitalism. We're very far from that. Um, so those are some of the core tenets she's known for. But she's also an atheist that gets into some deeper issues of philosophy and metaphysics. She's pro-reason, so there's no place for faith or religion in her philosophy. Exclusively, um, we acquire knowledge through our senses, our five senses, and then reasoning on the basis of what we observe and using logic. So that's kind of a bird's eye view of some of the key points of her philosophy.
Yeah, and so I mean, instinctively, the public probably has a lot of, when you're talking about like controversy, has a lot of reactions to some of these points. But I guess like, what groups of people do you find you disagree with the most? And then like, kind of what are these positions? If you could maybe steel man some of the opposition, especially in regards to objectivism, it's kind of hard for maybe the layman to like pick out like what to even attack there when you're talking about that. But I mean, like, what groups of people do you find that you end up arguing with the most? I know you talked about like atheists, that's going to be, Christians and other religious folk, but what groups of people do you find that you end up disagreeing with the most? And what are those ideologies generally?
I'm not sure who I disagree with the most in terms of just I disagree with so many people and I spend a lot of time arguing with a lot of people. So I've had debates with people on the left. I've done a lot of, for instance, I'm probably best known on YouTube for debating Sam Cedar because he's one of the largest platforms I've been on. He has a YouTube channel with over 1 million subscribers, and I've debated him many times. And he's on the left. I think many people would call him a progressive, although I would rather use the term regressive because I think he's taking us back away from a good direction and in a worse direction. I think a really progressive direction would increase the freedom that Americans have, which would mean rolling back taxes, rolling back regulations. That's the way to actually get progress. But I've debated many people on the left, probably more than people on the political right, so-called conservatives. I have debated religion several times on my YouTube channel, but also on social media. I'm active on there. Maybe I should just mention my channel in case anyone wants to check it out. Dan Norton 1 is my YouTube channel, and then Twitter, I'm at Dan Norton 111. I debate abortion a fair amount with conservatives, although it might be too generous a term to call it a debate. Often I just get hit with insults because my opposition doesn't really have an argument. I mean, this happens with people on the left too. On all sides, there's an abandonment or a failure to use reason and resorting instead, unfortunately, to ad hominems, insults, which I think shows a kind of bankruptcy that a lot of my opponents have. Which is not to say there aren't more thoughtful people out there who could put up some more reasoned opposition, but it's sometimes few and far between. But just going back to your original question, like who do I debate the most? I really don't know. I try to hit. I debate people from every side that's attacking my positions, and there's people. People often think in terms of the right and the left politically. And I don't know which of those I debate more. I guess on my YouTube channel, it's more the left. But if you consider social media more broadly, Maybe it's roughly even. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
But I've
well,
been going on
and
for a while, so I'll just pause there.
no, you're totally good. I think that's really interesting. And one of the things you kind of talked about was, morally bankrupt. I want to get into a little bit of morality. You talk about objectivism. Can you kind of explain what that is broadly? And then I'll definitely have some questions after that. But when you talk about objectivism as like a moral framework, unrelated to maybe its applications or the politics, what are you referring to? And then what does that mean?
Okay, so well, in morality specifically, objectivism would uphold egoism. So the idea of living for yourself, that's the proper way to live according to objectivism, as opposed to what? Well, altruism would be one contrasting viewpoint where you're supposed to live for other people, and you hold up as an ideal someone like Jesus or Mother Teresa, who devotes their entire lives to supporting, helping out others rather than living for their own sake. So that turns morality on its head. According to objectivism, you should be doing the exact opposite. You should um, prioritize your own life, your own happiness, and make that the central purpose of your life to achieve your own happiness. So that would be, in a nutshell, the objectivist view. There's much more I could say about ethics. So there's an entire list of virtues. Rand identifies 7 virtues which are means to achieving your happiness. And just to rattle them off, to put a little more flesh on the bones, rationality is the primary virtue, which I alluded to before when I said the only means of knowledge is reason as opposed to faith or feelings, just going by blind emotion. There's a place for feelings, but they're not tools of cognition, to use a term Rand might use. So rationality, using your mind to understand the world and act according to reason, right? So it's no use to just know the way the world is if you're not going to act accordingly. So to act on your reason. Now, in all the other virtues, there's 6 other virtues, which are various ways of being rational. So the 6 kind of subsidiary virtues in objectivism are independence, integrity, honesty, justice, productiveness, and pride. And we could get into any of those if you'd like, but just to keep it brief for now, those are kind of the core principles that make up an egoistic life, according to Rand, which might be surprising to some people. If you hear someone promotes egoism or selfishness, you might think, oh, well, that's the person who's willing to lie very easily to cut corners, get whatever he wants. But on Rand's view, that sort of behavior is actually self-destructive if you consider the long-run consequences of a policy of dishonesty or lacking integrity. You might get some short-run benefit from doing that, but in the long run, it's not going to be in your own interests. Either psychologically, you will suffer some kind of problem psychologically, but also existentially in terms of your relationships to other people. Very obviously, you might be thrown in jail, right? If you act like if you go around robbing, raping, murdering people. So you can suffer consequences, sort of physical consequences. You can be thrown in jail or even executed, if you live in a place with a death penalty. But even if you don't get caught, you'll still suffer psychological harm, I think, and Rand thinks, if you act in these short range, kind of emotionalistic ways without thinking through rationally the consequences of your actions. Like, I'm not going to want to be your friend if you're a rude jerk to me, right? So it's actually not in my own interest to act like a rude jerk to other people, which is kind of the stereotypical caricature of what a self-interested or selfish person is. It's actually in my interest to treat other people justly and fairly. My life is going to go much better if I do that. So there's a bit about Rand's ethics, and I'll pause there. And if you want to take it in a certain direction, go ahead.
Yeah, and I feel like I definitely agree with this and how it's applied. And there are also, it feels like, these internal mechanisms that prevent you from doing these things as well. Like if you were to steal, unrelated to maybe like psychological, well, kind of related to psychological consequences, but having not worked properly for that need or thing that you got, you're less likely to achieve more in your life because you aren't working the proper amount, I guess, to receive those things. And then that's on top of the consequences, the social consequences and the psychological consequences that you talked about as well, which I think are really important. But I guess like the level one objection to this is going to be like moral obligations to other people. So like that, I guess like one of the classic questions is like, are you morally obligated to save like a drowning child or something if it's gonna, be wildly uncomfortable to you and maybe even a risk to your life, but you're the only one who can do it. Can you kind of address some of these moral obligations or some of these things that maybe are a little bit trickier to navigate that don't like I understand that you probably shouldn't or that you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't do all these bad things because of the consequences, but there are definitely situations where like a moral obligation to help people or even dying for other people might be the right thing to do.
Yeah, sure, I can talk some about that. So, actually, these are contextual cases, so it depends on particular contexts as to whether you should do something or not. Like lie, you mentioned lying. Now, there are contexts where it would be good to lie, actually morally required. Like, for instance, if a Nazi knocks on your door and says, are you holding any, do you have any Jews in your attic or something? You might be morally obligated to lie. Like that is the moral thing to do. I mean, unless you think as a result of this, you yourself are going to be killed, then maybe you would rather someone else be killed rather than you if you have to choose. But if you think you can get away with it in this case, then I think it would be moral to lie. So there's no out of context absolute like in religion. You just have these commandments: "Thou shalt not lie," and without considering rationally what the consequences on your own life are. Now, but to take some other cases like the drowning child, there I think it's in many cases it would be appropriate. It would be moral to save the child. I think there would be you would feel badly if you didn't save someone's life just out of a minor inconvenience to yourself. Maybe you would get your shoes dirty or your pants dirty. Um, I think I would feel guilty if I didn't do something as simple as save a child in a pond, which maybe I would risk drowning it all in. Maybe it's only 3 feet deep, but for the child, maybe he will drown. So if there's really no risk to my life, and the worst thing that's going to happen to me is I have to take my clothes to the dry cleaner in extra time, then I think I'm going to be better off. I'm going to have a more benevolence feeling about the world and about myself if I actually save the child. And maybe his parents will even pay me back for the money I had to spend on the dry cleaning to save their child. I'm sure they would be super grateful, much more beyond the price of dry cleaning. But, even if I weren't going to be reimbursed for the cost of cleaning my clothes, I would still rather save the child. I don't want to live in a kind of world where people are so indifferent to each other that they're not going to, want to risk having dirty clothes for a few days rather than save someone's life. That seems a very nasty kind of world to live in. I wouldn't want to be part of that sort of world. So I would want to contribute selfishly in my own interest to having a more benevolent, friendly sort of world. So I think it would be in my interests to save the child, if it's at least if it's just like a one-off kind of case. Now, if there's children drowning every day all over the world, and you tell me, all right, after you save this one child, there's another one, 5 miles down the road who's also drowning, and there's another one 25 miles down the road, and you got to save that one too. And there's one in Africa also drowning. You got to take a plane trip over to Africa. So to be moral, what do I have to do now? Spend my entire life running around the world, putting out fires, so to speak, saving drowning children? I would say no. At a certain point, it becomes a sacrifice, destructive to my own life, to be helping out random people. But I can do a limited amount, but it doesn't become the centerpiece of my life to be orienting myself towards other people's problems, like a Mother Teresa, for instance, who, she decides to go live in India and take care of the poor for her entire life. I guess for free. I don't know. I don't know if she got paid or the point of it was to sacrifice, I think. I don't think it was a self-interested move. So anyways, helping others is perfectly compatible with being self-interested, but you have to think about if I help beyond a certain point, is it really adding to my life or is it just a drain on me? Is it a net subtraction from my own happiness? And you have to think about that in each particular case, and that'll help you decide what to do. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely I agree with there's one of the consequences that you pointed out that I don't think people think about a ton is when you like extrapolate the consequences of your decision to everybody else. So like you would want your child to be saved by a stranger, so you should probably save somebody else's child to kind of like socially engage the group in thinking that way. So I do appreciate that as a consequence. I think one of one of the important aspects of religion and kind of this more objective moral grounding when they try to peddle that kind of thing is that it takes away purposefully a lot of the autonomy in decision making so that we don't have to trust that the people around us are like calculating the precise things within themselves and like the pros and cons of doing this thing extended out into the rest of your lifetime. We don't have to trust that people are accurately calculating those things. Instead, we can kind of just describe a religion and say it just as like a moral, you ought to do this, to kind of take a lot of the thinking out of it so that people are more likely to do the right thing, but for less work, because it might be true that some people are incapable or I wouldn't trust with like making the correct moral calculations. And so instead, we create religion, we create these moral doctrines so that people can follow these things as like kind of a safer alternative. I don't know if that makes sense in the way that I'm describing it, but to me, it seems like when you're saying this objective, logic-based rationality, because I agree with the egoism part, but then we get into like requiring rationality to be making these decisions. I don't know how much I trust the majority of the population to be making accurate decisions, which is why I appreciate a lot of the work that, Christianity has done or these other like objective frameworks that try to say the same thing. I don't know what your reaction to this is or if I, described this well enough, but do you kind of understand what I'm saying? And then what are your reactions to that?
Yeah, I think I get the gist of what you're saying. And by the way, my computer's telling me the connection is a bit unstable and you were cutting out a little bit. So
Oh, okay.
hopefully hopefully what I'm saying will be intelligible. But
Sure,
um,
sure.
I think religion is not helping things by taking reason out of the picture. I think that makes things worse. Um, if people are just unthinkingly acting in a certain way, in irrational way, I would say, then there's it's not really. I wouldn't say that's a good way to act. Like, there's no way to know it's right or wrong if you're not following reason, I think. Um, but maybe I should. Well, maybe the lying is a good example to bring up again. So if you have these commandments like thou shalt not lie, and you say, well, it's easier to just give people this commandment rather than have them think rationally about what to do. Well, then you can have people just blindly following this commandment and doing things that are destructive to themselves, like handing over Jews to Nazis when they asked for it. So, is that a good thing to happen? Do we want people like irrationally or stupidly following orders that they haven't really thought through and understood the purpose of? I don't think that's good. Um, so when you take the mind away or reason, then you have people doing irrational things, and I think doing something irrational is bad. We want people to be irrational. I think it's there's a line in one of Ayn Rand's books. I won't say where it is to spoil anything, but the line is something like 10 truths accepted on faith is more dangerous than one falsehood accepted on the basis of reason, but you've made an error. So, because if you're following reason, but you make a mistake somewhere, at least your method allows you to correct. You can reason is self-correcting. So if you make a mistake somewhere, like if you're doing a math problem, you can see, on each side of the equation, there's a contradiction here somewhere because the two sides don't mesh. So you have this method that allows you to find inconsistencies, and eventually, even if immediately you don't hit the right answer, you have a means to arrive at the right answer. Whereas with faith, if you're not following any rational method at all, if you're just blindly going by commandments, then you could end up in all kinds of absurdities, and there's not really a way to correct your course. And then you can end up with, an entire civilization like the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, where for centuries, people are just living in this brutal, stagnant, impoverished mode of existence, in a faith-based kind of civilization. They haven't discovered a reason. So I think if we look at a historical example of a civilization where a religion was dominant, like the Middle Ages, when Christianity and the Catholic Church had power, I think that's some evidence that that's actually not a good sort of life. If you value life on earth, if you think life on earth and happiness and enjoyment is a good thing, then I think the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages is some evidence that actually religion is not the right way to live. We need something else like reason. So that would be, I'll say one more thing. So the term objective is not one that I would, this term has different senses. There's like a metaphysical sense of the term and an epistemological sense. I wouldn't use the term objective to describe religion. I think in the end, it actually maybe is better described as subjective. Because what's the basis of believing anything in religion? You just have some commandments, which historically, I guess, some prophet or charismatic figure like Jesus or Muhammad, they just have some bolt from the blue, some revelation. There's no rational explanation given for the tenets. It's just some subjective preference that some guy had hundreds or thousands of years ago, and then we're supposed to follow that for some reason. I wouldn't call that objective. That's totally arbitrary. And based on the whims or the emotions of some guy who can't explain his own beliefs, I would not call that objective. So that's just a terminological point, but let me pause there and give it back to you.
Yeah, well, and that makes sense too. When I was saying objective, I meant like that I did like air quotes in there. I meant like perceived objective as in God. This would be like to me the alternative to what you're saying that like I don't know. I just had a moral anti-realism conversation with somebody, so it's on the brain, but what I meant is that like
Uh-huh.
Christians perceive it as objective, although you would say I guess what I would say is that like I feel like if you read the Bible unrelated to maybe some of the, supernatural external parts of it, if you were to just look at the rules, you would find correlations between maybe like the Ten Commandments or the rules described in the Bible with egoism. Like you could find logical correlations between thou shalt not murder with you can just tack on the thou shalt not murder because it serves you the best. Something like that. And so it might be the pathway you got there is irrational, but you were technically successful in the answer because you're doing the same thing that would serve you the best, but you got it from a kind of corrupted source, which was irrationality. I guess my point, though, was that it might be true that, you know, 50% of the population should not be responsible for, we should not require that they have rational thought because I don't know if we trust them enough to have rational thoughts on morality. Now, the preference is obviously going to be rationality. It shouldn't be, indoctrination. Like there is definitely a superiority of like rational thought versus like religiosity. There's there's like a tier list, right? There's a ranking in that it would be better to be rational than it would be, but there might be a truth that some people aren't necessarily capable of that rationality. So we should just supplement that with religion so that at least we're not telling them, hey, be rational. And then their version of rationality is like murder everybody or like something just really wrong and stupid, frankly. Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, but the idea is that some people maybe shouldn't be trusted with rationality, and then that's where religion comes in, to where we can disguise rationality as faith. So the people who created the religion are like peddling it, like you should do these things, and the people who created it are rationally coming up with these rules, but the people who are following it aren't. Now, there's a preference again that these people should be rational instead of just following it, but that's like the kind of basis that maybe like rationality is in the wrong hands might be less beneficial than just telling them what they should think. Something like that. I don't necessarily think that I've subscribed to this, but it's kind of a concern when you talk about like democracy and like should everybody vote. That's kind of stupid because if everybody voted on murdering every like a bunch of people, democracy is bad in that way. That's the kind of pathway that I feel like I'm trying to take with this, that rationality might not like there is an objective right answer, but I don't know if everybody is capable of coming, not objective right answer, but there is a rational answer, but I don't know if everybody is capable of finding that rational answer. So then the solution would be irrationality pointed to the right answer, something like that. I don't know if that clarifies what I'm talking about. You kind of hit on a lot of this too, but I don't know if that clarifies what I meant when I said that.
Yeah, I think I get the gist of your point. Um, so I don't think maybe I have a different view of people in general in terms of their rational capabilities, in terms of whether most people could arrive at a reasonable, or what I would regard as a rational sort of ethic. I don't think it's ever good to just lie to people and say, well, um, since I don't think you're rationally capable of figuring out what the moral thing is, I'm just gonna make up some faith-based system. I guess you wouldn't say this to the person directly, but this is what you kind
Right,
of be doing
right.
behind the scenes. I'm gonna make up some faith-based code of morality and just try to tell people they should follow that or else they're going to go to hell or something. I'll make up some story about an afterlife of punishment or reward, and you have to act in a certain way in order to get to heaven as opposed to an eternity in hell. I don't think that's the right approach, but I don't know that I have more to say that would be different from what I've already said. Um,
Yeah,
like it,
that makes sense. And that's not a point that I think I would that I would dive too deep down, but I guess it would be the fear of externalities and this general point is something that I'm going to bring up once we get to more political action and once we get to more um like of the applied ethics in terms of economy and capitalism and stuff like that. That's where that becomes a little bit a little bit more real to me. But as far as like morality, I don't think I'm convinced that most people couldn't come up to like a reasonable moral stance if we just told them to be rational. So I don't know if I think that, but I feel like I do understand what you're saying in regards to that. I guess the fear then would be that it would kind of be the straw man's of the term selfishness, where they're saying that like there's this
Mhm.
moral obligation to help other people. Um, and something a little bit stronger than that, kind of this moral realist view that there does exist this moral obligation to help people. Um, I guess what can you say to kind of help, you know, either because to me it seems like there's a you can use egoism to come to that conclusion that you should probably help people in kind of the ways that you had described and that it's self-serving to do this. But is there a way you can kind of squash quickly the moral realist view that something outside of our rationality makes it to where it's true that these moral things exist?
Squash the idea that outside. Sorry, could you say that last part again? I'm not
Yeah,
sure I
basically,
got it.
like if I were to argue that there are moral, real truths that like God said that this is morally real, or that outside of our rationality, it is true that you should help people because it's just the right thing to do. Um, I feel like some people, especially religious people, believe that to be the case. That like even if rationality were to tell them you shouldn't help people, they would be like, I don't care, I'm gonna help people. Is there a way that you can kind of like pry people out of that trap to get them to be a little bit more rational, or to get them to be a little bit more aligned with like egoism in this way? Or I guess how do you get people out of that?
Well, it might depend on the particular person. Some people, I think, are not open to reason, and I do think we have free will, and you can't force a mind. Like people have to be rational by choice, and I, I think some people are just they're dead set on their faith or their religion, and there's nothing you can say to change their mind. That's something that has to be done from the inside. Like there's that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Well, you can lead a person to the rational view, but you can't make them think. You can't make them accept the. You can't make them accept reason. That's just something someone has to choose to do. Um, I mean, I would try to like you could give someone a book like The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, which presents in fictional form. It dramatizes a life of an egoist as Ayn Rand conceives of egoism, which is you can see if you read the story that the protagonist Howard Rourke lives a very different sort of life than what is stereotypically called an egoist. But he's also definitely not an altruist. So you can the novel makes very clear that the way most people think of the options available to them as to the type of lives they can live are not the only options. Ayn Rand has come up with the third alternative. So it's not either you sacrifice yourself to others like an altruist would, or you're a rude jerk and you sacrifice others to yourself, like maybe a murderer or a rapist would do. That's instead there's an alternative way of living where you're not there's it's a non-sacrificial sort of life. You're not sacrificing yourself to others or others to yourself. So you can give someone a book like The Fountainhead, or if you want it in nonfiction form, you can read her essay, The Objectivist Ethics, and you can just show someone there's this other way of living, and she fleshes it out for hundreds of pages, and someone can consider that and say, "Wow, I didn't realize there's this other way to live." Now, for many people, this is a revelation to them, and not in a mystical sense, but it's just very new to them. They haven't considered them. Many people they're raised religiously, and religion presents this false alternative, like either you sacrifice for others like Jesus, or if you don't do that, then you're this rude jerk, you're a murderous rapist, pillager, barbarian, whatever. But no, actually those aren't the only options. You can live a different sort of life. um, and many people find this very compelling, and they become objectivists, or at least fans of Ayn Rand after they read it. But other people who are also exposed to Ayn Rand for the first time, they read the same thing, yet they go on persisting in their religious views. Maybe they become even more intensely religious, or communist, or socialist. So I think it really is just a matter of free will and choice. Like you as an individual have to decide how you're going to act and whether you're going to be rational. Um, so there's a few thoughts on persuading others. I think Ayn Rand is very persuasive, and so I would recommend people read her if they think there's some problem with their own lives. maybe there's another way they haven't considered. But let me just pause there and throw it back to you.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes a ton of sense too. I feel like if there were like an answer of like how to perfectly convince somebody of this thing, like we would just know it and then everyone would be convinced of it. So I don't think there's just like a right answer, but I just wondered, I guess, if there were avenues that you take or if there were certain fallacies that you point out or something like that. So that is very interesting. And I imagine Ayn Rand does a really good job too of explaining those things. I wanted to get into a little bit more um of the government side and some of this capitalist, this, free free society of, having to pay a lot of these things. Um, can you just go ahead and I guess and describe again like Ayn Rand's how she would describe how society should function without, I mean, you talked about like taxes and a lot of these government programs. Can you kind of describe like why it is the case that these things should not be funded in the way that they are, or why this is the ideal society?
Yeah, it is based on her ethical system of egoism. So the reason she supports the kind of social system she does is because she thinks it's best for the individual. So it's best for my life that I live in a society of freedom. And she would say that that's true of everyone. It's best for your life that you live in a society of freedom. But what that means is no coercion. So, pretty much everyone would say, I'm for freedom. But if you are consistent about adhering to what that means, it's going to have all kinds of implications, on Rand's view at least, which most people would reject. Like, for instance, taxes and regulations. So, taxes are anti-freedom. Why? Because they coerce you to give part of your money that you've earned to the state. So you work a job, and part of that money is taken out of your paycheck. Or if you're an independent contractor, you're I guess on your honor to pay once tax season comes around. You have to pay a certain percentage of the money you earn to the government. Not because you want to, but because if you don't, you'll go to jail, right? It's not left up to you as a choice. Um, Whereas what on Rand's view, the pro-freedom view is that you have a right to the money you've earned. So you work a job, then the paycheck you get is yours to do with as you choose. So if you want to spend your money on buying a new car or going on a vacation, you should be able to do that with 100% of your money. Some of your money should not be siphoned off, confiscated to pay for somebody else's health care or somebody else's education. Now, if you want to help that person voluntarily, then that's fine. You're free to do that. You can donate money to charity if you want, or if you've got someone you know personally, you want to help out a friend, you're free to help them out. But what should not be happening is the government, under threat of taking you to jail, forces you at gunpoint, essentially, because people with guns will show up at your door at some point if you resist taxation. You are forced at gunpoint to turn over some of the money you have earned to these other causes, like welfare or Social Security, Medicare, public education, public roads, all these things. So if you really believe in freedom, which Rand does, and she thinks that's best for the individual, you should be able to control your life, make it go as you want to. Then that means the government should not be forcibly taking your income or regulating you through such laws. Just to give one example, like minimum wage, right? This is instead of allowing people to freely contract with each other and say, I agree to work for this amount per hour, and I agree to pay you this amount per hour, the government steps in as a third party and says, no, you're not allowed to work for that amount. You have to pay this other amount. So that would be the government regulating people's behavior, taking away their ability to freely decide how they want to live their lives. So if you really believe in freedom, then you have to get rid of all taxes and regulations. And we can talk a lot more about that, but let me pause there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is probably the meat of the conversation. I'm definitely a lot more skeptical of this than I am of maybe the more the egoist ideas. But I guess on a broad level, to me, it seems like paying into taxes and government is the best thing for you, even though it is sacrificing some of your freedoms. Um, to me, paying into the government and I guess getting to live in I don't know if you're fairly patriotic, but I feel like I am. But this is just it's a really good country. It's a wonderful country to live in, especially comparatively. But um, paying into that system is kind of an insurance plan against some of the things that you can't control. So I mean, in an ideal government, now there are ideas. There's kind of a lot to go here, but in an ideal government, you're paying into it as kind of a form of insurance against things that you can and can't control. So like healthcare, or I guess even like standardized healthcare, or us paying to help, the homeless, or all of these programs are insurance plans against the idea that you might become one of the people that needs one of these things or programs. So to me, it's kind of within your best interest to pay into these programs with the idea that you might become one of these programs, whether it's of your control or against your control. But unrelated to that, it seems like there are other externalities of paying into these programs that are good too, as in like having more people who are at a higher quality of living is going to benefit you in these economic ways, in these social ways, and in other ways like this. I mean, it's going to benefit you in these ways. And in turn, I just don't think that the sacrifice of that particular freedom, or that, 30% of your income or however much you're getting taxed, I don't know if that's a negative enough externality to outweigh the positives. And then you can always opt out, I believe, by moving away, by living in a different country. But obviously we're talking about like the you know, ideal social structure for our country. So I don't know if moving away actually solves the problem, but to me it feels like by trying to get rid of government and taxes, you're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, to say that like a lot of the externalities like corruption or over inclusion with social programs, or under inclusion, or funding towards things that aren't important. Like I know you talk a lot about wars or different things overseas. Like all those things are maybe bad uses of our money, but I don't know if that means that we should just get rid of taxation, unless you could say that like the negative, externalities of losing that freedom, losing that 30% of your income is actually worse than maybe the positives of paying into the government that ends up helping you, or at least acts as an insurance plan against the things that could happen to you. So I guess like what are your responses to that? Or like what am I missing, or something like that?
I'm thinking it might be useful to approach this from a very personal, like one-on-one kind of example. Like, do you have a right to tell me how to live?
I have the right to tell you how to live, but I don't have the right to, I guess the next thing would be to force you to live that way, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. Do you have a right to
Oh.
use force to make me live in a certain way?
If it's against my, I guess like autonomy or my body, then yes. Um, in other
Okay, well,
ways, no,
so
no.
okay, well, now we just need to extrapolate from that. Does somebody else have the right to force me to live in a certain way?
Um, they can force you to live in a certain way that leads to externalities, that maybe aren't necessarily harming you or a person. Um, like you can't say anything that you want to say, even if it like we already have laws against saying things, even if it doesn't necessarily jump to a negative externality, if that makes sense. Like I think a lot of people talk about this like with speech, like you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, even though technically you can choose to just sit there and stay there, so it doesn't have to have that negative externality, although it's still illegal to do that.
Well, the reason you can't yell fire in a crowded theater if there's not really a fire is because you could cause all kinds of harm, physical harm to people, maybe other kinds of harm as well. But at least that. But let's say I'm not causing physical harm to anyone. I'm minding my own business. Now, Do you or does anyone else have a right to force me to act differently than I'm acting?
Yeah, I don't think anybody has the right to do it, but I feel like with the egoist mentality, they should. Or as in like it would benefit you to lose some of these freedoms for the positive externalities of it, as in it would be beneficial to you, even though it is against maybe a sense of freedom, but you're paying into that sense of freedom, and I guess you could move. So I'm a little bit confused, but I'll continue to answer your questions. I guess I don't want to jump too far, but no, people do not have the right to force you to live a certain lifestyle.
Well, that doesn't seem consistent with your view. If you also think it's right to tax people, then you're effectively saying, yeah, other people do have a right to force me to live a certain lifestyle. So there's some kind of inconsistency in your view. If you think you personally and any other person doesn't individually have a right to force me to live in a certain way, yet you are in favor of taxes, then I don't see how that's consistent.
Well, I guess I could move, right? Like I don't have to live here. I could I could live in another place.
Uh, yeah, you could move, but there's still a question of do you have the right to uh, to engage in certain practices, like in imposing taxes or regulations? Like, um, could we say this also about rape? Like, if you don't want to be raped, well, you could just never go outside of your house. So, and yet you choose to go outside of your house sometimes, and you might get raped. So it's on you.
Well, that's I mean, I see the correlation, but it's a little different because taxes are an expected, like like you're paying into the society that you're living in. You're choosing to pay in because you could just move. Whereas I guess like not going outside at the risk, there's no risk of getting taxed. It is a guarantee you will be taxed at these moments of your life, and you could choose to avoid
Yeah.
taxes for the rest of your life by moving. So it's slightly different because there's not like a risk involved, if you know what I mean. I think that's
Well,
kind
we,
of
we
an
could take the risk out of it and just say, let's say the government came up with a law and said, if you're a woman, you're subject to rape. Maybe this is some misogynistic culture, maybe like or or maybe it's a Sharia law, Muslim kind of culture where maybe you're allowed to beat your wife. Um, and so it's there's no uncertainty about it. Now, are you going to say, well, you could choose to leave the country, so it doesn't really make sense to complain about this law that allows people to get beaten or raped. So
well. I mean,
no problem with that law.
that's kind of how it is right now, though. In other countries, when we're in America and we see that other countries are doing laws that are oppressive or against rights, we don't live there, so we don't. I mean, it would kind of seem reasonable that you would just leave. Now, activists complain about other countries, and this is where wars ensue. When other countries are impeding on other people's rights, we then do something. But I guess we kind of already do that as a society when other countries are doing bad things. I think we have the right to complain about it and maybe even intervene, but I guess the idea is that you're choosing to live there, and so then you could leave. And again, I I appreciate the idea of freedom, but I think that like if you're it would be self-serving to sacrifice your freedom to gain the benefits of the society. So to me, it seems like the self-serving part is more important than freedom. Although I agree that freedom is important, I don't I kind of rank them differently than maybe you might. Although I've heard you say that the number one tenet is self-serving, and then number two would be freedom. I don't know if that's maybe not applying to the situation or something like that. But we already kind of judge other countries and we complain about them for doing oppressive laws and stuff like that that are anti-freedom.
Uh, Yeah, well, to some extent, I think in some cases we don't do enough. Like when Iran took hostages back in 1979, I thought we had a very weak response. I think that merited going to war with Iran, but we didn't do that. And over the last few decades, they've financed terrorism around the world and caused all kinds of problems and many deaths. So I think we've been far too weak uh, in standing up to our enemies. Um, but that gets us a bit
Well,
further
and
afield
yeah,
from what we
and
were.
truthfully, I'm very uneducated as far as like foreign affairs, historical. So I wouldn't even be able to give you contextual examples of this. But I'm hoping that in good faith you're able to understand, I guess, the point that I'm making that other countries do oppressive things that are anti-freedom that, you know, we don't we're not morally obligated to, I guess, care about unless we choose to. And it could be the same way if you thought that our laws of taxation were oppressive, it would kind of be the same way.
Well, I think it does. There is there's some kind of obligation to at least in your own mind condemn anti-freedom oppressive regimes around the world. I mean, if you know about them, um, you might just be uninformed, but if you do know about them, I think one should, at least in one's own mind, recognize them as bad, but maybe it's also appropriate to speak up about it and maybe even take action, depending on how, if it's really affecting your own interests. Like, for example, Japan, when they uh, flying in their kamikaze fighters into Pearl Harbor, that's crossing a certain line where I think it's no longer appropriate just to say Japan is a bad place with a totalitarian regime. They're actually affecting our interests so much in a negative way that we have to take military action in response. Um, uh, but I think there's a fundamental similarity between Japan attacking us or Al Qaeda attacking us on 9/11 and taxes. They're both kinds of force. They're using force, very different degrees of force. One is murderous, one is not, at least not in the short term. Maybe you could argue that in the long run, taxes do cause increased death. But at least in the short run, it just means you have to fork over some of your money. So there's definitely a different kind and degree of force, but it's coercion nonetheless. It's still force. It's someone initiating force against you, making you live in a different sort of way, or not living at all if they're murdering you. Uh, um, so there is that fundamental similarity between foreign aggressors, nations, and then taxes by your own nation or regulations. Um,
Yeah, I guess to me it seems a kind of irrational to see taxes and then kind of focus on, I guess, the freedom part and not on the positive externalities. Um, Now again, the positive externalities are on an ideal government system. Now, there are definitely examples of taxes that aren't going towards something that benefit, frankly, anybody, but maybe it's not going to benefit, or it's not even something that should our taxes should be going to. But to me, it seems like there's a rational equation of the harms that maybe losing some of this freedom might be, or losing this percentage versus the benefits of the security of the government that we have is incredible or awesome or whatever, or even just effective. It doesn't even have to be great. Um, to me, that equation, um, like, yes, it is coercion, but one, you're kind of consenting to it because you could go to another country, although you might be motivated to not do that because we might be the best country. But beyond that, the positive externalities, it might still seem like an egoist's dream or choice to prefer paying the taxes, even though it is of coercive origin, but I don't know if it even feels that way when it's like a good deal in an ideal government.
Yeah. I don't think it is beneficial to an individual to be coerced. Like, there's a question of whether it can even possibly be a benefit. Um, there's a line coming to mind from somewhere in Ayn Rand's writings of um, providing someone with a picture gallery at the price of cutting out his eyes. So, like, you can't even evaluate something as good if you're being coerced, if you don't have the means, the eyes to see it. You can't. It's not a value to you. Um, so there's no. You can't force a value on someone. In other words, here, let me give a somewhat different example. Like, let's say that you're the ideal career for you, given your abilities and your your genetic makeup. You would be an amazing lawyer. Let's say you're just cut out for that, but you haven't recognized that yourself. Maybe you will, given enough time. Maybe in 10 or 20 years, you will come to see that you would be amazing at that job and you would love that job. But right now, you don't see that. Right, you prefer to do something else. Let's say you're really passionate about being a musician, so you spend all your time practicing the guitar or whatever instrument it is. But then the government comes along and says, "No, we're going to force you to go to law school because that's really what you are best capable of doing." And now, is that good for you? Like, would you enjoy that sort of life, or would you rebel when the government tries to force you and say, "No, my passion is music. I I would rather die or kill myself. I'm so in love with music than be forced to do this stupid career as a lawyer, which I have no interest in." Um, that's how you feel at the moment, at least. So, is it good for you to be forced into doing this other thing, which you personally don't see? I don't think it is. I don't think it can really be good for you unless you personally evaluate it as good. Now, you can throw a wrinkle into this and say, well, it's okay to force children. People often bring up children in these sorts of cases. Like, the child doesn't know what's best for him, and he might just want to eat pizza and ice cream all the time and never eat his vegetables. So, do we just let that happen? Well, no. I think as a parent who's reached the age of maturity, you have an obligation to control how the child acts to some extent. But if we're talking about adults, legal adults who have reached the age of reason and maturity, at some point, I think you have to, step back and say, no, this is an individual making his own choices, and he has to see for himself that something is good. If it's going to actually be good for him, it's not appropriate to make someone live his entire life as a slave to what the government wants him to do, because it, in its superior wisdom, I don't know how we're going to evaluate the government as superior in wisdom. Is this some other species, some elite human being that has some power to decide for everyone else what's best for them? No, I don't think that's the kind of society that's right. I think it's the society that's best for individuals is the one that leaves the individual free to decide for himself what kind of life he wants to live. So unless you want a total nanny state, prop up some authoritarian dictator who's going to tell everyone what's best for them to live, I don't think it is best for individuals to be forced. They have to see for themselves that something is good, like the career as a lawyer, in order for it to actually be a value in their lives. But I've been going on for a while, so let me pause there.
Yeah, I have a couple questions about that. I think that in a sense it feels like your boss at a job is also coercive in the same way, and that they're making you do things in return for money. And now the example you would give is that you could quit the job or that you sign the contract knowingly before you get into the job. But to me, those seem kind of similar to you can leave the country, you can move somewhere else, or you can vote and do these because another thing too when you're talking about like nanny states like viewing these things, we essentially, again, ideally, in an ideal society we are voting for the level of taxation, and our words and our priorities are valuing the levels of taxation that we're getting, and that like theoretically we have decided what we are to get taxed on, or at least we're voting in the representatives that are choosing those things for us because we can't have, we can't calculate 365 million opinions. And so, but essentially we're kind of voting for the level of taxation that we're receiving, and we're choosing where those things are going. So I don't know if you can, extrapolate that to like a authoritarian deciding what's right for us. In a perfect world, we're deciding what's right for us with our votes, with our taxation. But this coercive, I guess, language, to me, it seems kind of loaded. Like the term coercive seems loaded when you're continually deciding, influencing, and hopefully changing the level of coercion on you, and the externalities of that coercion are benefiting you in a way that in a way that you're deciding, in a way that you're paying. So to me, it just like I understand the fundamental principle that like underlying it all, the origin is coercion. In that I guess you couldn't decide otherwise, but I don't know if a rational person would decide otherwise either way. And so with like the lawyer, excuse me, with the lawyer example that you were bringing up, it might turn out that in 3 years, the lawyer is like, yeah, they were right. This is awesome. This is like so much better than being a musician. I kind of sucked. Anyway, you might have different opinions on whether or not that was okay. Now, I'm a little skeptical of the government making decisions that big. I don't know if 30% of your income is that big of a decision. I don't know if it's actually that big of a coercion. But I assume you might have different perspectives and opinions on that.
Yeah, well, if 30% of your income doesn't mean that much to you, I'm happy to take it from you. So you're free to
Yeah, right.
donate to my Patreon or send me a check if it doesn't mean that much to you. And
Right,
everyone
right.
out there who feels that way, feel free to fund my life.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
so I certainly value 30% of my income, and much less than that. Every penny of it belongs to me. There's a principle. If I earned it, it's mine, and no one else has a right to it, no matter how little it is. Like it's not okay with me if some robber comes into my house and steals a plastic spoon. That it's mine by right. It doesn't matter what the value of it is on the market. So, uh, but to address some of the things you were saying, so I don't believe in mob rule and or a dictatorship of the majority over the minority. So it's not enough for freedom to not have a dictator, one person who's lording it over everyone. It could be just as bad or worse to have a majority of people dictating to you how to live your life. So if 51% of the population votes to enslave the other 49%, and I'm in the 49% that gets voted to be enslaved, it's no consolation to me that a majority voted for it. It doesn't make much difference to me whether it's a dictator who's put me in chains or 51% of the population. The point is I've lost my freedom. So I think the value of the U.S. system, at least it's in its original intention, is that it didn't have mob rule. It had the principle of individual rights. Now, tragically, it failed to apply that in practice to black people, and so we had slavery for many decades. But that's inconsistent. That was inconsistent with the original principles of that this country was founded on. And they fought a war over it, and eventually they got rid of slavery and made the country more consistent with its founding vision: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all men. Right? It says all men are created equal, not just white men. So the country had some corrections it had to make, but if it's just unlimited majority rule, I think that's a bad system. A lot of people talk about democracy as being a good thing, and I think it is. I think it was a step forward, like in ancient Greece, is when democracy was born. In Athens, I think that was the first democracy historically, and I think you can see that as an improvement over rule by just some king, where you had people having more of a say in their lives. But democracy sentenced Socrates to death, right? He was going around allegedly corrupting the youth by having conversations with people. And some influential citizens in the Athenian assembly didn't like that, and so they voted him to death. And now, is that a good kind of system where you just don't like what some guy is saying, and so you can kill him? I don't think that's a good system. I think there has to be limits on what the people can vote on. There are certain things that should not be subject to a vote. One of them being the freedom of speech. I think another being your right to property. So I don't think if a majority gets together and decides, we don't want Dan or Elijah to keep 30% of his income, it would be better if that income could be better used elsewhere on my pet project. Then we somehow have a right to dictate to Dan or to Elijah or to anyone, how they're going to spend their income. I don't think that's right. I think that's a violation of rights, and a system that really values freedom is one that doesn't succumb to mob rule or a dictatorship of the majority, so to speak. You also talked about a boss and being able to leave the job and being able to leave the country. I doubt those are analogous. So there's a question of rights. So where does a country get the right to impose taxes in the first place? I don't think. I think a nation doesn't have rights per se. It only has the rights delegated to it by the citizens that make it up. The nation is not some mystical super entity that exists on its own apart from individuals. It's just a collection of individuals. And it has no rights other than rights that are grounded in the rights of individuals. So I think since no individual has a right to, like you personally, you, Elijah, don't have a right to force me to give up some of my money, and nor does any other individual. Well, you can't now, when you get people together, delegate your rights to take some of my money to the government, because you don't have that right in the first place. So if we sometimes I think it's useful to start on a desert islands kind of example, and I brought these up in many of my videos. Like imagine you're just alone on a desert island, it's just you and one other person, and what's the best way for you to get along with the other person? Do you want to make a slave out of the other person, or do you want to try to peacefully interact with the other person? I think it's in your interest to try to interact peacefully with the other person and work together to survive. And if you add a third person, I think that principle still holds. I don't think it's good for the third person to coerce the others or be coerced himself. I think it's still in everyone's interest to work together peacefully. And no matter how many people you add, I think it's always best to just peacefully coexist rather than someone trying to lord it over the others. And there's never a point. So I think if you, the principle that I think governs the best way to act on this island is that everyone is left free. Their voluntary choices are respected. So you're not coercing anyone. And there's no points. No one ever gets the right. It never becomes right for one person to start forcing others. So when they get together, when you get thousands or tens of thousands of people together to form a society and make it more formal formalized and have a government, there's no basis for delegating a right that you have as an individual to coerce people to the state. So there's no basis for a state to get this right to coerce people through something like taxes. So I don't know that it really helps your case to say something like, well, you can leave the country. Okay, sure. But where does the country get the right in the first place to put me in a position where I would want to maybe leave the country? Where does it get the right to put me in a position where I have to give up 30% of my income, or else I have to go to jail? Where does the state get that right? We can't just take that for granted. I want to know, where does it get that right? And I don't think there's a story that you can tell or that I've ever heard that justifies where that right comes from. But let me pause there.
Yeah, yeah. I guess there's a lot to talk about in there. Maybe I'll start from the end and then go to the beginning. But um, to me, where the country or the state gets the right to say that it is an effectiveness thing, and this comes back to this distinction between peace and fairness. And I think that like peace, I don't think should be the end goal. It should be justice or fairness. And so one of the things you had mentioned kind of at the beginning of this was um, that we don't want it to be mob rule. But to me, this extreme form of capitalism is as mob rule as it gets, in that we are voting with our money and that we have 100% of our access. And we vote with our money if all of us wanted to pay to not have roads. Or if nobody wanted to pay for roads, that is a mob decision to not have roads. And then now the disabled, your grandma, your all the old people who can't travel as well are just kind of out of luck because the money outweighed. And this is why regulations, this is why restrictions, this is where fairness comes in, as opposed to peace. And even in the example of like the desert island, you have these two people. If one of those people breaks their leg, I feel like that person has the ability to force that load onto the muscular guy who can kind of build the log cabins. When it's two of them and something happens to one of them, then the universe kind of forces that not broken leg person to pick up the slack of the person who can't do it. And these are kind of the points of regulations in that like government operates to go against mob rule, even though it's voted by us, which is kind of circular. It just feels like the essence of government is to prevent and add restrictions so that mob rule cannot impede the fairness of the government or the what the government is trying to do. Because again, it comes back to why I think it's still within your self-interest to pay into this government. Because if you're on that island, you can't necessarily make it true that you will never break your leg. You can't make it true that you'll never need that assistance because your leg is broken. And so it's kind of within your best interest to use the government as kind of an insurance against that. And that's the same thing with these regulations and with the things that exist. I can't necessarily make it to where Dan is making the most perfect decisions about airport security or airport regulations or about like food. He has to have this nutritional degree. He has to have these senses. He has to be able to fight terrorists on the plane because of the risks that he's willing to take. And this extrapolates to every single decision that you'll make about every single thing that you purchase, buy. The restrictions are there because it has to allow for fairness. It has to allow for these things. And again, the state has the right to do that because of the effectiveness. It's like if you want to live in America where you have the freedom to do whatever you want and you have the most freedom to do what you want or to be who you want to be as opposed to other countries. I think there's a quote that's like, America is the place that you can be the best version of yourself. If you want the benefits of that, you pay into this. And the secret is you're going to benefit from paying into this too. And then you can leave. And that's kind of the choice or like where the state or the government gives you the opportunity where it gets the right to kind of either say you pay or you're out. And that's to me, that's where it comes. It comes from this like weird fairness thing. And again, this is all separate from whether it is effectively doing that. This is the ideal version of government. The quibbles about whether it's actually doing that, that's a whole different discussion. But to me, that's kind of the essence of what we're talking about, where this distinction comes in, because to me, it seems like paying some of that freedom, paying some of that, allowing some of that coercion is a good price to pay for the fairness and the other freedoms and the effectiveness, something like that.
Okay. I'm not sure where to start. There's a lot that you mentioned, but so you think it's a it's self-interested for me to give up some of my freedom. I will somehow benefit from doing that. That's your view. And so if I disagree with that and I think no, it's not in my interest to give up my freedom, then I guess we're just going to come to blows over it. Um, I guess we'll just have to deal with each other by force since we haven't agreed. Since you want
Or you
to
can move,
impose
or
things on me. What? What's that?
or you could move as well. There is that force option too, or you could move away as well as an alternative to that.
Yeah, or you could move away.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, why should I maybe I shouldn't surrender my life to the brute, to the thug who wants to
Yeah.
coercively impose himself on me. Why should he be the one to gets to keep keep his pleasant life here? No, maybe he should go live in the jungle with the animals since he likes the coercive lifestyle. He can go see if he really likes coercion. Go live in the jungle
Yeah.
for a while, or or, or,
Yeah.
or go to a country that doesn't have any problem with coercion. Maybe go live in a totalitarian state, or go live in an anarchy plagued place like Somalia, where you just have these warlords, gangs fighting each other, or may go hang out with the cartels down in Mexico and who human traffic. If you're okay with coercion, maybe you should go to a more coercive place and leave the land of freedom, the land of liberty that is the United States. Although it's become much less a land of liberty in some important ways over the last century or more, with the growth of the government telling us how to live within the New Deal, especially in the so-called Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, the expansion of Social Security and Medicaid. There's been a growth of government, but yeah, I think I want to live in a free place, and I guess there's sometimes I hear people tell me like, well, if if you don't like it, you can just leave. Like, but I mean, anyone who's advocating for change, like I guess uh, like people who like the Nordic model, right? The Sweden, Denmark, Norway, where you have large government programs. I guess they're actually higher taxes but lower regulations in some ways than the United States. You could tell people in America who like that system, well, just go live in those countries. You could leave. You could leave. What, does it make any sense for you to stay here if that's your ideal? Um, Maybe that's a good question for them. But for me, I think the best choice for me is United States, and it doesn't only depend on things like the political system. There's other things like the language. Like even if I lived in a country which were a little bit more free than in the United States, if the language is different, it might be a net loss for me to move to that country just because it's so hard to communicate with people that I might want to stay in the United States, even though it is a little bit less free. There are limits to that, right? If it becomes a totalitarian state, then I'd rather live somewhere else. But there are more things than just freedom that go into the choice of where to live. Uh, but anyways, I don't want to ramble here. I've maybe one other thing I should mention. Oh, you brought up the case of like breaking your leg on the desert islands, and uh that I don't think if that happens, I don't think that That doesn't mean that someone now has a duty to serve you, especially if it's going to come at a risk to his own life. Like if resources on this island are so scarce that you're going to die if you don't spend 100% of your time trying to catch food for yourself, then I don't think you have any obligation to keep the other person alive. Um, if you can afford to do it, then maybe you do. Maybe it is moral, but there's no out of context duty. It depends on the particulars of the case. Just like I was saying before with the lying, right? There's no absolute religious sort of commandment, thou shalt not lie. Likewise, there's no commandment, thou shalt not, or thou shalt help other people. It depends on the circumstances, and you just have to judge it on the particulars of the case. But let me pause there.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess if there were three people on the island and one of them breaks their leg, now each of you have to say, let's say, spend 30% more energy to help that person. And then later, one of the people also breaks their leg, you get to now receive the benefits of their extra 30% of, you know, their labor that they're allocating to you. And so that's where I say it's self-interested. I don't think that necessarily there's like a moral obligation, but I do think that it is like the effective thing to do because of the self-interest. But I wanna wrap it up here soon. We've been going for, a good hour and a half, but I want to give you the opportunity to kind of just wrap it up. If there are themes or morals or lessons or any advertising or plugging that you want to do, this is kind of like your platform to round us out for this episode. And you really just get to say the last word on any of the stuff we talked about. Or if there's anything that you want the listeners to glean from this episode or anything that you've said so far, the floor is yours to wrap us out.
All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. Just on that last example, so I think it might make sense, like if someone breaks their leg, one of the three people, and then one of the other three people breaks his leg later, then I think it could make sense. But this could all be voluntary. There's no need for coercion to be involved. Like I might voluntarily help out the guy who breaks his leg. I don't have to be coerced. I might say it's in my interest to help this guy. Maybe he's a good friend, or maybe he's a good producer. He can build stuff that he can trade with me. He can add to my life. He can make it better. I don't need someone to coerce me to help him. I can decide that voluntarily. And likewise with him, he can also make that decision. There are things like private charity which exist, and there's even private charity today. Even with all the government taxes and regulations, you still have people who donate to charitable causes. So I don't think there's going to be a problem, and I think there's going to be much less need of charity. There's not going to be dire poverty like you have in sub-Saharan Africa, where people living on less than $1 a day. You don't have that kind of poverty in a free society. So there's much less need for charity because it's such a wealthy society. With freedom, you get progress and increased standard of living. And for the little charity that is needed, I think it will be abundantly available in a free society. But now, just to round it out more, so if anyone wants to learn more about the philosophy of Ayn Rand, which I subscribe to, the best place is to read her books. So I mentioned her novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Anthem is a much smaller one, which you can also read. She also wrote nonfiction books. So I encourage people to check that out. I've also got a YouTube channel, which I mentioned before, Dan Norton 1 on YouTube. Lots of videos there, more debates and discussions, so you can check that out. And on Twitter or X, Dan Norton 111. And I think that's about it. So if anyone else out there wants to have a discussion with me, feel free to get in touch through any of those channels. And thank you, Elijah, for having me on. I appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, Dan, you were wonderful. Thank you so much for chatting with me and agreeing to be on the show.